This is a Parshat podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to the Matan Podcast, where this year we're exploring the weekly Haftorah portion. This week's episode has been dedicated in loving memory of Helene Bers, Chaya Ayala bat Eliezer, by her Cantor grandchildren. For those of you who listen weekly, sponsoring an episode can be a great way to honor a memory, a friend, and even mark a momentous occasion. For more information, contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or the Matan office. Parshat Miketz opens with Paro's twin dreams, which interestingly parallel Yosef's twin dreams. The chief cupbearer remembers Yosef's dream interpreting talents, and he's called from prison and makes his monumentally important impression on Paro, both by interpreting his dream and offering unsolicited advice about how to prepare for the years of famine ahead. It is a life-changing moment that catapults him into a new and blessed direction. He even names his son Menashe, which is explained as he who causes to forget the suffering of my parents' home. Yosef announces in this way that his life has turned a corner. And yet in the following scene, due to years of famine, he comes face to face with his brothers. The past, it seems, is harder to bury than Yosef imagined. And while he has risen to greatness because of dream interpretation, the dream from his father's home has caught up with him. Yosef does not reveal himself to his brothers and speaks with them harshly. He offers them food in return for an imprisoned brother and a promise that they will return with Binyamin. Unbeknownst to them, he places food and money in their bags. He acts with an enigmatic combination of kindness and cruelty. The brothers later return with Binyamin, desperate for more provisions. After inviting them to a regal meal replete with abundant food and filling their bags with clothing and money, Yosef sets up the final goblet test, framing Binyamin as a thief. The Parsha ends with the brothers in great distress at the prospect of Binyamin receiving the death penalty. This week's Haftorah is officially from Melachim Aleph Perek Gimel, the story where two women approach Shlomo for judgment, making claim to the same son. But this Haftorah is rarely read. When there is one Shabbat Chanukah, we read Zecharia 2:14 to 4:7, Bet Yudalit to Dalit Zayin, which presents a vision of renewal and divine support for the restored Jewish community after the exile. Zecharia describes the purification of the high priest Yoshua, symbolizing the spiritual cleansing of the people and the reassurance that God's presence has returned to Zion. He then sees the golden menorah flanked by two olive trees, images that echo Chanukah's themes, and hears the famous message to Zerubbabel, the governor overseeing the rebuilding of the temple, not by might and not by power, but by my spirit. We'll talk about that in our episode today. This prophecy affirms that the Mikdash will be completed through God's guidance, emphasizing perhaps spiritual strength rather than military force. But in order to delve deeper into these visions and their significance for this Chanukah season, I'm so happy to be sitting here again with the always insightful Rabbi Alex Israel. Hi, Rabbi Alex.
Hi, pleased to be with you.
Who is a teacher and scholar of Tanakh at Matan Sharon, Yeshivat Eretz Tzvi, and Midreshet Lindenbaum. Rabbi Alex has his own excellent short-form Tanakh podcast, I listen, by the way, which follows the daily 929 learning schedule called the Tanakh Podcast, which can be found on all major podcasting platforms. To read more of his writings, you can check out www.alexisrael.org. Rav Alex, it's great to be sitting here again with you.
And great to be with you, Yosefa.
We've spent a lot of time in the past talking about the book of Breshit. I think we even spoke once about the book of Shmot. But today we are going to go deep into the book of Zecharia. Now, we've had a lot of Haftarot from Treyasar in the past few weeks. So our audience is very familiar with the fact that Treyasar is a collection of prophets from all different periods. But Zecharia places us back in the world of Chagai and also Malachi, of our Second Temple prophets. So that's where we are, but I really want you to draw us more into the book of Zecharia. It's a long book in relation to the books of Treyasar. Some of the visions are very difficult to understand, also for the Parshanim, not just for us. And so before we sort of go into Mamash, this Haftorah, which spans 3-ish short chapters in Zecharia, why don't you just bring us a little bit into who he was?
Sure. We'll talk a little bit about who Zecharia is. First, let me just begin by saying what I love about, even before we even open who is Zecharia, we have the symbol of Medina Israel in this Haftarah.
Yes.
The actual seal of Medina Israel is a menorah. Interestingly enough, it's the visualization of that menorah is based on the menorah in Titus's arch, but it's a menorah flanked by two olive branches, and that vision comes from chapter 4, from the end of our Haftarah. And so, first of all, we're in this interesting territory of state building. It's interesting that was chosen in order to represent the state of Israel. But where are we? Let's literally get into this moment of, and who is Zecharia? The story is like this. Jews have come back to Judea, really to Jerusalem and the surrounding area, towns in about something like a 15-mile radius of Judea. They haven't populated the whole country. These are the returnees from Bavel. These people were in Bavel for 50, maybe 70 years, and they came back in response to Cyrus's pronouncement that Jews were allowed to return and were allowed to build their temple. And in fact, they set a foundation stone for the temple, and they even started bringing sacrifices on a sort of makeshift altar. And then everything stalled. It's not clear exactly what caused it to stall. Was it lobbying by certain anti-Semitic groups? Was it something to do with the economy? But things stalled. And for 15 years, nothing happens in Jerusalem as far as building the temple. Jews are living there. We know from the parallel books of Haggai, and we'll talk about that in a second, that the economy was really bad, and there was really an uphill struggle. And here we find ourselves in Zecharia in the second year of Darius. There's a new king, a new Persian king. At this point, the Jews in Judea do not have independence. They are a province under the Persian Empire. And we're going to hone in. The book of Haggai and Zecharia take us to this moment. There's a new king. It's a new, brave new world, a new era. And Haggai and Zecharia want to rekindle hope. And they want to say to the people, we can build it, right? If you build it, right?
They will come. God will come is
God
what
will come.
they're looking for.
That's exactly what it says, right?
Yes.
Rani v'simchi bat Zion, be joyous and happy, O daughter of Zion, ki hineni ba, I'm coming. V'shachanti b'tochechnu, Hashem, I will dwell amongst you. And when you hear v'shachanti b'tochech, it's clearly a reference to the temple, because v'shachanti b'tocham. And we have this strong sense that God will, if you look at Uvachar od b'Yerushalayim, He will choose Jerusalem again. I will just already give you the spoiler, which is that Sefer Ezra tells us that it was the morale boosting. It was the fact that Haggai and Zecharia lifted the people and gave them vision and gave them hope that got the temple built. In the second year of Darius, they started building it. By the 6th year, they had finished it. It took 4 years. This is the moment we're hearing the rah-rah speeches which enable people to get up and build. By the way, at this point, they're already on the initial stages of building the temple.
I just want to just shine a spotlight on a point that's sort of underlying what you're saying, which is that, you know, we've seen this in the past few months in a different direction, but how the way people speak and people's efforts and the words they say and the way they try and impact people's spirit can impact the way the world actually works. Meaning it's not just adding words to the world, but it actually does something, whether it was, you know, political pressures that got hostages out, or it's other things. Whenever we wonder, is it worth it for me to say something? I think about this all the time. Is it worth for me to open my mouth? Is it worth for me to write something? And the point is that when you want to try and impact change, this is a great example, one of obviously millions throughout history, where what people say and how people's morale is impacted actually makes a difference in what happens in the world.
You know, you're so right. And if you just mentioned that we're during these weeks reading the Yosef story, when Yosef eventually reunites with his brothers, and he says, I'm Yosef, and they say, oh gosh, you know, I can't believe you're still alive, whatever they say. And he says, no, don't worry, God sent you here. He could have said 50 other things, which could have basically exploded the relationship. But he said, I am a messenger from God. This is all God's plan. Hakol b'seder. Here you read, and I know this is not Zecharia, but you read Haggai, and he even tells them, he says, some of you saw the first temple, and now you're seeing this, and you're saying, Ka'ayin beinechem, halo kamo, ka'ayin, it's like nothing. But he says, but I'm telling you, gadol yeh kavod habayit hazeh ha'acharon min harishon. This second temple is going to be even greater than the first. And it's so significant. They clearly, people needed somebody to say, yes, we can really do this. And this is a huge moment, and that's exactly what Zecharia is doing. Zecharia has many visual prophecies. Yeah. Sometimes my students, some of them are quite psychedelic. You have various flying women and cauldrons and different, I don't know, black, red, white horses dashing through the scenery. Some of my students have asked me in the past whether Zecharia was on drugs. I have no clue.
The commentators think that actually it was a waning of prophecy, right? Some of them say it was a waning of prophecy, so it wasn't as clear yet. Zecharia himself didn't really understand it, so instead of interpreting it, he just told us what he saw, right? There's different ways to understand the book.
Correct. So let's. What I want to do is so we've set the scene that Zecharia is really trying. By the way, the temple was started to be built already from the 1st of Elul in that particular year, and here we find ourselves later on. The date of these prophecies is on the 24th of the 11th month in Chodesh Shvat. So the building's already underway,
yeah.
But they're good cheerleaders. They're keeping boosting, and you have beautiful nevuot here. Prazot teshev Yerushalayim meirov adam uveheima betocha. That Jerusalem is going to be suburbs. You won't even be able to measure Jerusalem, right? Nevuot which we feel have come true in our own days. But if we dig into we get a window into a scene in the heavens, in God's entourage, and here I'm reading from Perek Gimel, Vayareni et Yoshua Kohen HaGadol omed lifnei malach Hashem. Yehoshua, who is the high priest, stands before the angel of God, v'hasatan omed al yamino lesitno. And the Satan, is standing on his right hand to accuse him. Let me say a word about Satan.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning.
Yes. In the Bible, we have angels. Angels are usually an expression of a divine will. You could say that God has many, many different functions, and you could say God came to heal somebody, or you could say God sent healing energies. If I had to think about what those healing energies could be, I might call them Raphael, right? Mm-hmm. In other words, God's healing. Or if it was something very wondrous, I might call it Michael, or something very powerful, I'll call it Gibor El or Gavriel. So you can have lots of functions in God, and the word Satan actually means an obstruction or a counterforce. Mm-hmm. Now in Christianity, I'm no expert in Christianity, but in Christianity they have a sort of very dualistic view of God, and there is God, and then there's the Antichrist, or there is Satan, and it's like a force of good and a force of evil. That is not our concept of Satan. Satan for us is the accusing attorney. It means that we've all done good things and bad things, and if we're being judged, if Yoshua Kohen HaGadol is being judged, the Satan is standing on his right hand and saying, you know what, I don't know, this temple being built, but the Kohanim aren't so great, and I don't really know about how pure they are.
Sort of like this oppositional idea. What's important to mention is just that dualism, that's exactly what the Torah, even in the creation story, really tries to go against. It doesn't want to objectify evil, because then that would mean that evil is something that is outside of God's domain. So the Satan here, who also shows up in the book of Eov, right? I think it's also significant that they're in later books, right? They're not really there in earlier spaces in the same way. But it's really important. Don't imagine that pitchfork, that red figure with a pitchfork, because it's really not a Jewish idea.
One of the interesting places where, if I'm not mistaken, in the story of Bilam, when the angel comes to stop Bilam going on his journey, it says, "V'hamalach omeid lesatan lo baderech." He is coming in order to obstruct him on the way. The angel there is not called a satan, but it uses the verb lesatan lo to obstruct his route.
Yeah.
So here we have the accusing angel, who is now going to dig up some dirt around Yehoshua. And now God is going to say something remarkable. He says, Vayoma Hashem ala Satan, Yigar Hashem b'cha Satan, V'yigar Hashem b'cha habocher b'Yushalayim, halo ze ud mutzal me'esh. God says to the Satan, basically, you be quiet. You shut up. I don't want to hear a word out of you. I don't want to hear a peep. And you know why? Because Habocher b'Yushalayim, today I choose Jerusalem, and frankly, Jerusalem is an ud mutzal me'esh. This is a very interesting phrase. Sometimes people used to talk about Holocaust survivors as being an ud mutzal me'esh. So this phrase Ud mutzal me'esh is a really interesting phrase. It was used in Israel to represent Holocaust survivors. Ud mutzal me'esh means, imagine there was a terrible inferno and there's a leg of a chair which is left, or there's like a scrap of a half of a photograph left. Literally the last scraps out of the fire, the literally thing that you can salvage. He says like this, today he says, Satan, be quiet. I don't want to hear from you. I'm choosing Jerusalem today. These are the survivors. These are the survivors of the Churban. This is the She'erita Pleita, the few people who came back from Bavel. Today, I am giving Jerusalem, I'm pressing the restart button. I'm giving Jerusalem a new opportunity, a new chance. I have to say, this is not coming in a vacuum. There's a line, an amazing line in Megillat Eicha, where Eicha says, Avotenu chatu ve'inam, our fathers sinned and they are no more. Va'anachnu et avonotehem savalnu, and we bear their sins. Mm-hmm. People felt weighed down with the sins of the Churban. They know they'd lost their sovereignty, they'd lost their dignity, they'd lost their freedom, they'd lost their central institutions because of generations of sin. They feel weighed down. And God is saying, I don't want to hear any bad stuff. Today, I choose Jerusalem. Look at these people. They're a bunch of survivors. And now, he says, Yoshua is wearing dirty clothes. We'll see what this dirt is. And he says to the people there, Hasiru habagadim atzoim me'alav. Take off his dirty clothes. And he says, Re'eh ha'evarti me'alecha avonecha. I have removed your sin from you. V'halbesh otcha machalatzot. I'm going to give you clean clothing. And they say, put a tznif tahora rosho. Give him a clean hat on his head. What he's doing is he's enrobing the high priest in brand new robes. His robes are all soiled from sin. He is the embodiment. This is happening in heaven. This is not happening on earth. And it's an image of the high priest who is soiled with all the sins of the Jewish people. God is saying, today we give everybody a fresh start. Everybody gets a new set of clothing. This is an amazing moment which Zecharia is trying to transmit to the people. The people are saying, it's so hard. How do we build this temple? Nothing's going right for us. And we've got centuries of sin behind us. It's not for nothing that God destroyed the temple. Zecharia and Chagai are trying to boost their confidence. And they say, wait, God pressing the reset button. All of the debts of the past, I'm wiping out those bad debts, and now we are starting anew.
It also reminds me of the symbolic act of Yirmiyahu, where he has the salid chagura, right? He has to bury the chagura in the ground, and it gets dirty, and then he basically has to show them, this is God wears you so close, but you've become so dirty, meaning, again, this image of like the dirty clothing. But I think, again, this going back to this idea about the rhetoric, meaning what we've seen so much in the prophets that we've seen from Treyasar, but especially the Second Temple prophets and also Malachi, is that they really work off of the conceptions of the people. Like, we see that more even than, let's say, in many of the earlier bigger sections, let's say, of the bigger prophets like Yeshayahu and Yechezkel, which of course are also working off of the people. But in our small snippets that we get from these Treyasar, so many of them are taking a line or a belief of the people and then responding directly to them. And so you also feel much more of like a close connection between what the prophet is saying. It's not some vision far off. It's literally for right now. Like, this is the current event prophet. You know what I'm saying? It's not, well, in another, many, many decades or in Acharita Yamim, this is for you right now. This is supposed to strengthen you at this exact moment in time.
Right. So this is what we're talking about to the high priest. The second prophecy which we see, the second image, is the image of a menorah, menorah zahav kula, and there is some sort of gula, there's some sort of reservoir on the top of it, and it says there's 7 candles on it, 7 lights, and shnaim zeitim aleh echad miyimila gula ve'echad al smola, and one on the right hand side and one on the left hand side. Now, by the way, I don't think it's like in the semel, in the crest of Medina Israel, that it's just an olive branch. I think there were 2 olive trees on each side, and even there's a symmetry between like the image of a menorah, which like has a trunk, and then branches out.
Yeah.
We talk about a 7-branched candelabra.
Yeah,
right?
and the word tzemach appeared right before, right? We have Avdi Tzemach speaking about the Yoshua being the, again, he's this remnant, he's this, I mean, the bad translation is like a stump, but it really means like he's this new sprouting of the leadership.
A new sprouting.
Yeah.
And Zecharia says, God says to him, he says to God, Ma ele Adoni, what's going on? Mm-hmm. And as frequently happens in the book of Zecharia, he says, don't you know? And he says, no, I haven't got a clue. And he answers and says, Lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach ki im beruchi amar Hashem tzvaot. Not with strength and not with might, but with my spirit, says God. Mi ata haragadol lifnei Zerubbabel mishor. Now he's not talking about Yoshua, the high priest. He's talking about Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel is the political leader. Mm-hmm. And he says, before Zerubbabel, even a mountain, even a har gadol is going to be lemishor. It's simply going to be like flat. You won't be running uphill. You're going to be running on the straight. You will take out the capstone with shears. In other words, you will eventually put the top stone into the Beit HaMikdash and you will succeed in building it. And there'll be cheers of hooray, hooray, right, for this. Now the question is, what is this image of the menorah got anything to, what are those trees on the side got to do with lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach ki im beruchi, or the mountain becoming a flat plain?
And also, for a mountain to become a flat plain, we would think that we would need chayil and koach, right? Like, let's add another question there. There's some sort of statement here about the fact that what they're doing is physically building, but God is saying that's not really how you're going to achieve it, not with that strength, but with this ruchi, which is also an interesting question. What ruach is it talking about? The Parshanim talk about different things. Is it ruach Hashem? Is it the ruach that Hashem gives to Daryavish now as the new king? Meaning, where is this ruach coming from? Is it the prophet's ruach?
So I'll give one interpretation, then it'll be interesting to see if you adopt a different one. I'm always trying to explain the imagery. So I actually have an olive tree in my garden, and I planted a lot of the Shiva Minim when we bought a house in Israel, and I remember we got a few olives. And I remember learning about Channukah that for the olive oil, you squeeze the olive, and the first bit of oil that comes out, that's for the menorah. So I tried to do what I learned in elementary school, and I tried to squeeze the olive. Nothing comes out of an olive, right? You need to let an olive sit like for about a month in a box so that it all just gets all soft. And then what the Chazal actually say, that the Jewish people are like an olive. If you really want to get anything out of it, you have to put pressure on them. You have to grind them up. Well, that's what they do. They put pressure on them and something oozes out. First you crack them, then you put pressure on them, and eventually you actually grind them up and slowly let the oil ooze out. In other words, getting any oil out of an olive tree is just a long, slow process. Here, what's happening? You've got a menorah. And there are 2 olive trees, and the olive trees are like pumping out oil, right? And there's like an automated system. And the automated system is literally taking the olive oil out of the olives, ba'otomat, right? It's literally happening in an automated process. What does that mean? Lo b'chayil, you won't need to do it through pressure. Lo b'koach, you won't need to go through that whole thing. Ki im beruchi, I'm going to make things just happen. What before until now has been impossible, now it's just going to go smooth. There are not going to be any uphill inclines for the runners amongst us, right? You're just going to run flat, right? It's not going to be like running in Gush Etzion. It's going to be like running in Tel Aviv. And it'll just be flat, it'll be easy. And that's what he's telling them. This is a message, by the way. We've been given a very similar message to Yoshua, who is the high priest. It's a message of purification, that all of the sins, you're going to become pure again. To the political leader, Zerubbabel, what he's saying is all of the obstacles which have been in your way, right, are now going to be, the menorah, which symbolizes the temple, as well. Remember, in the second temple, there is no Ark of the Covenant. So the central symbol of the temple becomes the menorah.
Yeah, it's a really important point.
And so the menorah becomes so the central symbol of the temple, and he also talks about the Even Harosha, right? Even Masu Habonim Haita L'Rosh Pina, right? the stone which was rejected by the builders has eventually become the capstone, the cornerstone, the top stone of an arch, which holds the whole arch together.
It's interesting, though, also that the political leader, the symbol that's used to strengthen him, is Dafka, the one from the temple, meaning we don't have this separation at the moment. When we do have two figures, we have the high priest and we have Zerubbabel, but they're all connected right now in this project of building a Mikdash. So
right.
they're sort of connected to each other.
Correct.
But there's two things that come up in your description here of the vision. One is that this is not really how things pan out. Meaning,
right.
they do work very much. They do succeed at building a Mikdash. But when you read through Ezra and Nehemiah, again, trying to figure out exactly how the timeline works, definitely some of it is going to be after this prophecy. It doesn't exactly pan out that way.
Let me just help people with the timeline.
Yeah.
Jews come back to Judea around 537 BCE, right? They spend some time building the temple. The temple's eventually built about 22 years later, 515. They build a temple, it's great, but we know because about 65 years later, around 450, a new person comes on the scene. His name is Ezra, and later Nehemiah, and they find Jerusalem is still in shambles. The city gates have not been put on the walls. The walls are broken down. Spiritually, people are intermarrying. People are not keeping Shabbat. The priests are not supporting the temple, and that's the same period it would seem as Malachi. So in other words, even though they get it built, the people aren't upkeeping it. The standard of religiosity in Jerusalem is pretty miserable. It takes a long time to build a state.
Sounds like a related story to our lives today, but maybe we'll wait for that for a moment. So the point being is that this helps them get over that hump, but it's not like things then are hunky-dory after that. It's just important to say that, meaning the prophets are promising something, but it's not a forever promise. It's not the thing that's going to last them forever. They're going to have to continue on their project. Right.
I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you. Now looking back at history, we know that it didn't pan out.
Yeah.
And therefore, but they were giving such amazing, there must have been a huge sense of disappointment.
Yeah.
Because obviously, even though Zecharia said, this is going to be phenomenal, this is going to be incredible, right? Things didn't pan out like that. Now, I have a hunch. And the hunch actually comes out of Sefer Chagai, where in Chagai a different message is given to Zerubbabel, where he says, V'hafachti kisei mamlachot. I am going to turn over kingdoms. There are going to be wars. There are going to be wars. I'm going to take you, Zerubbabel, and I'm going to make you like a chotam. A chotam is a signet ring. Who has a signet ring? Let's look to our Hashverosh story. The king. Mm-hmm. I think we're in the second year of Darius. Second year is effectively, Darius is at the beginning, and we know from historians that there was a little bit of trouble with Darius getting into his stride. I think these prophets in the second year of Darius all thought there was going to be a revolution, that the Persian Empire was going to sort of fall, or at least lose its grip on the land of Israel, and that Zerubbabel was going to become the king. And all of these grand prophecies, which are promising everything's going to go great, is assuming that the Jews are going to regain their independence.
Their sovereignty, yeah.
They're going to regain their sovereignty, and Zerubbabel is going to become the king, and we're going to get our glory days back again.
Yeah.
Now, as you said, this never happened. Well, actually, let's say that again. It did happen, but it happened about 300 years later, in the time of Channukah. In other words, the way that the Chashmonaim saw this was, these were the prophecies for the second temple. They didn't come true. But prophecy, Ne'emanatahu v'ne'emanim d'varecha v'davar echad midvarecha lo yashuv reikam. When you have a prophecy, it's got to come true, but it just might come true later. Mm-hmm. So I think that the Chashmonaim come to power. And how did this become the Haftorah? Because they said, it wasn't true about Yoshua and Zerubbabel, but we are both Kohanim and political leaders. And so interesting, because we actually sing, Azeg Mor Vashir Mizmor Chanukat HaMizbeach, but the Mizbeach is not our symbol of Chanukah, it is the menorah or the Chanukiah, right? So in other words, they clearly, by putting the menorah front and center in Chanukah were saying, wow, this wasn't about them, it's really about us. We've been waiting for 300 years for this prophecy to come true, and it's happening now. It's about us. The revolution didn't happen then. We did it.
I mean, first of all, wow, for anyone who, I think most of us, this is an idea that we don't always think about so overtly, and it's so important. I think it's also enforced by the idea that we know from Sefer Maccabim, from multiple versions of it, that the Chashmonaim constantly looked to anchor themselves in their own history, meaning they didn't want to be some random avant-garde warriors. We know from Maccabim Bet that they specifically say that we want to make it 8-day holiday, so it'll be like Sukkot, and right, because we weren't able to fulfill Sukkot because we were fighting in the fields, and this idea of saying, we heard our prophets, we know our story, and here it's happening through us, is, again, the parallels to our world today is obviously also as significant and important. But to say those words are still relevant, and that it may not have happened then in that way, but they're happening in our time. Very often the Chashmonaim are looked at, we think that Chazal didn't totally approve of their behavior because they were combining Malchut and Keuna, right? That's sort of like the common idea. I think to me, the bigger chidush in what you're saying is Dafka that they saw an advantage in the combination of those. Like, we have it all. We have both tickets here. Right. So we could be both Yoshua ben Sadak and Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel, who, by the way, disappears in history. We don't really know about him after that.
Right. Well, yeah.
But that's fascinating. That they thought that there was going to be a different kind of movement. It didn't happen now. Meaning the prophets thought that there was going to be a revolution.
There's this huge, but I mean, it's very, very clear through Chagai, but it seems also relevant in Zecharia that they really think that things are shifting geopolitically. Yeah. And they got, we're pleased they got the Bet Mikdash built. But I really do think that it's always like a little bizarre, 8 days of Hallel, whole Hallel. Even for Yetziat Mitzrayim, we don't do 8 days.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
They clearly saw this as not only being a second Sukkot, but they saw it as being Chanukah HaMizbeach. Yeah. This was like the Chanukah HaMishkan, which is also
this is why we came now. It finally happened now. This is why we built this.
This is it, and they see themselves as having prophetic sanction, even though they are after the era of the prophets.
It's fascinating. I think also, in a way, to also tie it to our times today, I wanted just to take another look at Lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach, ki'im beruchi, because I think that there is sort of a fundamental question that sits at the root of this verse, which is the way that Geula, or our stages of change, how they come about in the world, right? Meaning this question of, here it sort of praises the idea of that it's going to be beruach, right? That it's kind of feels a bit like tidier that way, right? So again, whether the ruach is coming through whoever, the prophet or the king or Koresh or Daryavesh, whoever it is.
You're thinking about like that Rashi Masechet Makot, that the second temple will not need to be built with bricks and mortar or whatever it will be, but it will just come down.
The third Beit Mikdash.
The third Beit Mikdash. But it will come down in fire from heaven. It will be divinely, it'll just land here.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to bring out, because a concept like this, which here we say is so inspiring, kind of sits at the bedrock of a lot of the machloket that we have in the world since, before the establishment of the State of Israel and still today, of, are we supposed to be bringing it b'chayil u'b'koach, or is it supposed to come on the shoulders of a ruach? Do you know what I'm saying? And I think that here it's giving points to the ruach side. I know, because I also know you, that you also believe in the chayil and the koach, right? But I think that it's an important sentence, because it's a debate within the Jewish world that has persisted till today. Right.
When I think about the imagery of Yoshua standing there in his dirty clothes, which represents sin, and then God says, take away his dirty clothes and give him new clothes. It suddenly made me think of a poem, which is a very, very famous poem by Natan Altman. It's called Magasha Kesef, the silver platter. And it was actually written it was actually written even before Medinat Israel, because it actually talks about Medinat HaYehudim. They didn't know what it was going to be called. But Magasha Kesef is read frequently in Yom HaZikaron ceremonies. And it's written, Natan Altman tried to write it in a very biblical style, And he imagines that there's sort of he imagines almost like a Matan Torah-like scene where everybody's standing and there's sort of this smoke in the sky and fire in the sky and everybody's ready for a ceremony. And then out come a young man and a young woman. Right, Azmi neged yatsu na'ara v'na'ar, and they stand opposite the nation. And the way they describe them is lovshei chol v'chagor. They're dressed in like battle dress. They're dressed in their khakis. V'kivdei na'alayim. They're wearing their heavy army shoes. And they come up in total silence. And there's this phrase, Lo hichlifu bigdam. They didn't change their clothing. Lo machu od bamayim. They hadn't had a chance to launder their clothes at ikvot yom haperech velel kava eish. They've been working in the day in the fields. These are the chalutzim who've been working in the day in the fields and at night, in the line of fire. They've been fighting. They're beautiful young people, but they are absolutely exhausted. And then they literally fall down and they don't know whether they're alive or dead. And it says, then they say, we are the silver platter on which the Jewish state was given you. And this notion, which is so real in our world, of all the people who've been fighting for us in their army fatigues, sweaty, heavy boots and whatever it is, and they are the silver platter, but they haven't washed their clothes. It doesn't come easy, right? They fall down because they're completely exhausted. There's no, yes, and we have our Satan Omed Liyamino, we have, whether it's the world press or whether it's, the various lobbies against Israel, digging up all of the dirt of whatever they can, and we don't get those clean clothes, right? And yes, indeed, you're 100% correct that it's part of our argument, maybe an argument with the way that we imagined Geula. We thought the Geula would happen with a Mashiach. We'd wait one bright day, the sun would shine, and we'd get a message, Mashiach is on his way, and we'd all somehow make our way to the Holy Land, and everybody would be tzaddikim, and there would be eternal peace. It doesn't seem to be panning out that way. Or at least,
at this stage,
maybe we've got to wait for that temple to come down from heaven. We've got to wait for the God bit. But the way, or put it this way, Zionism said we've had enough waiting, right? Zionism said we've got to make a move. We've got to do our hishtadlut. But the result is that our clothes are dirty, right? We are sweaty and we're blood splattered, and it's just so interesting. By the way, you're also 100% correct that even though this is the Nevu'ah, it didn't turn out that way, right? As I said, 50, 60 years later...
I am being the Satan to this Nevu'ah right now. No, I'm saying that seriously, because I read it and I say, on one hand, this is inspiring. On the other hand, everything that I would say many of the people listening to this podcast, that we've put our bet on is that it will be b'chayil u'b'koach. And so we wish it would be this way, but sometimes this belief, which gets translated into many sugyot in the Gemara, and especially in Masechet Sanhedrin, where we have a conversation about how Mashiach is going to come or what Geula is going to look like. And I just think that ultimately, I always understand the approach which says, let it fall from Shamayim. I get what sources you're looking at, but I think I square sadly on the side of, I really hope there'll be ruchi, but there's going to have to be chayil and koach.
Right.
And I'm going to bet my life on chayil and koach.
Right. As long as we are in the world that we know, we're going to need chayil and koach.
I don't see another option,
right.
But I appreciate that the prophets are trying to inspire this way. And I'm just saying that, while I think that there are so many important parallels between this Second Temple period and the period that we still live in today, from before Koma Medina and also well after the establishment of the state, this is like one line that when I read it sometimes I have like a little kvetch, you know what I'm saying? And I say, we can't always import everything exactly the way we want to, because our life doesn't look like that at the moment.
Right. Well, when we're talking about Channukah is the candle in the darkness,
yes.
Right? And I would definitely say that it's maybe a nevuah like this which gave people absurd faith when everything was stacked against us, right? In that darkness of Galut, at the darkest point of the year. And where do when you listen to some of the hostages who have come out of literally Me'afeilal or out of those dark tunnels, and they talk about how, they I was just listening to an interview with one of the hostages last night, and he talks about how he would lie in the tunnel imagining what it would be like to go visit the sea. to go visit, to get into the water and the sun shining, to feel the water in his skin. Just wild stuff. And this idea that we need sources of hope.
Yeah.
And to a large degree, Chanukah it is about trying to shift the narrative. It's the Midrashim which talk about it being as the darkest point when the days have been getting shorter and shorter, and now they're going to change. We light the Chanukah in our window or out the doorway, that liminal space between inside and outside. A lot of the time, Chanukah is about transitions. And you started off by talking about giving hope, right? The ability of language and dreams, right? Yosef is a dreamer, right? To give hope, to be able to change what we believe is possible. And maybe that's part of what's going on here. Maybe it isn't 100% realistic, but maybe we sometimes need grand visions, even to get ourselves into the area of Chayil and Koach.
No, I love that. And I think I just want to end with one more comment, because you just made me think about it, that one of the deepest connections between the story of Yosef and the story of Chanukah, which again we're remembering because we have a special Haftorah for this Shabbat, is this point about how we tell the story, right? And you said earlier that Yosef clearly adopted for himself a narrative throughout all his years in Mitzrayim, right? He adopted a narrative that this was God's plan, meaning he believed it. But I'm saying it's a choice. It is a choice how we frame the things that happen to us, and the Chashmonaim, as you pointed out so beautifully, really wanted to see themselves through the image of being the fulfillment of a prophecy that maybe was said 300 years earlier, but that it's being fulfilled through their hands. And these beliefs create the world we live in, meaning they're not just, I'm choosing to believe that and it makes me feel good. No, it completely, utterly changes the course of history, because what we believe we're working off of and what we believe our role to be is going to, in many ways, determine how we then behave in the future. And we see Yosef decides to spearhead his life story and go in a completely different direction that will mean everything for the future of Am Yisrael. And when it comes to the Chashmonaim, again, maybe in the broad scheme of the war, we weren't victorious in the broad scheme, but we, throughout the centuries, have refracted the way that we tell that story of their role in history. And they saw themselves as being part of this role in history. And our celebrations of Chanukah, which of course have developed over time, also really bring us this idea of hope and saying that this is that moment of lightness in this long winter. The winter will keep going, right? We will still have a future, and there will be difficulties along the way, but choosing to take that moment and say that this is a moment that I'm going to share my gratitude for the miracles that have happened.
Right. I think you're 100% right. I also think that when our children read about these last 2 years, there's a very big question about what narrative we're going to tell.
Yeah.
I grew up with my parents' friends talking about how they went to volunteer in 67 or 73. And even though those were horrible wars, the vantage point that I got it from was this was an exciting time to be part of Am Yisrael.
Yeah.
And, we're living with a lot of loss and a lot of pain and a lot of attrition that we've been through the last 2 years. But some of those things have a shorter shelf life. And when our children grow up, they will talk about the terrible attack of 7th of October. They will talk about the heroism. They'll talk about the way the hostages kept their faith and their belief that they would be freed. They will see a huge amount of heroism in this period. They'll see a togetherness of Am Yisrael. And again, it's the question of whether you see yourself as being that next chapter in the prophetic story, that next chapter in the Jewish story. I think that's exactly what the Chashmonaim did to Chanukah. I think it's what's happening here in this prophecy. And I hope that we will have the strength and the hope to be able to do that for our own times.
Thank you so much, Rav Alex, for being here.
Okay, toda.
Chanukah Sameach.
Chanukah Sameach.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.